So today we're going to be going over the Glass Castle bookcase block. For me, this represents the Glass Castle from the Throne of Glass book series by Sarah J. Maas. But as I was designing it, if you change the colors from blue to green, it looks very much like the Emerald City from Wizard of Oz. So I think this can be used in multiple different fandoms, multiple different genres. But for me, again, this was the Glass Castle from the Throne of Glass book series. So I'm going to go over from start to finish kind of what the nerdy quilter patterns will look like for the 2025 Fantasy and Fae bookcase quilt along. So to start off, you're going to print the pattern that's available for free on nerdyquilter.com. When you print that, one of the key important steps is to make sure that you print it at 100%. You can usually find this in your settings or do a quick Google search if you have a Mac or a PC and figure out how to do that, but print it at 100%. If you don't, the block may not come out to a finished size of 10 inches. It's not that big of a deal if you do print it at a different size, but some issues can arise if you print out, say, at accidentally 90% on, say, the 5th of the month, March 5th. But then you go to make a couple of more blocks and you forget exactly what percentage it was, and now you print it at 98% or 100% a couple blocks in a couple weeks later. Well, now you have two slightly different sized blocks. You can fix that by adding some background sashing pretty easily, but to avoid all of those problems, just make sure that whenever you print it, it's at 100%. So typical pattern will look like this. You have a title page that shows a general picture of what the block will look like. Sometimes, for example, on this one, it's just a computer-generated image. Sometimes it'll show a block that was actually tested by myself or one of the other testers with credit given to them on the title page. So this will also include the finished block size. So this one is going to be a 10 inch by 10 inch finished size. For the entire bookcase quilt along, every single block will either be a 10 inch block or a 10 inch by 20 block or a 5 inch block, with probably 98% of the blocks being a 10 by 10 size. So consider the 10 by 20 as a double block, and then I'll show you a little later on what we can do with the 5 inch blocks and how we can combine those with some of the other free book patterns to really make a custom final bookcase quilt for yourself or whoever you're making it for. So after we go past the title page, the next page is going to be an overall paper side image. So here, this is what I use when connecting each of the individual patterns pieces together. I like to work off of the paper side. Some people's brain doesn't work like that. So I also included an overall fabric side as well. So if you'll remember, one of the key components for foundation paper piecing is you're actually working on two sides at once. So one side will actually be fabric, so pretend this isn't paper, but you'll have fabric that looks like this, and then before you take the paper off the back, you'll have paper that looks like this. So it's a little confusing now, but once you get your head wrapped around that, it's pretty straightforward, and then you just rinse and repeat over and over and over again. So that's page number 3. Then we go on to the actual paper pieces here. So this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 individual sections. What we're going to do is we're going to cut those out, sew them individually, and then once each section has all of the individual pieces together, for example, this F section here, we'd sew F1, F2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then F7. We're going to do that for all 7 pieces. Then we'll come back, we'll connect them together, and then finally we'll end up with a block that looks just like this. So step number 1, before I actually go to cut out the individual paper pieces, is I like to color them with a color pencil. So some quilt patterns or some quilt pattern designers will actually include individual maybe number markings within these sections or a color code or some sort of like symbol identifier. While typically I find that very useful and very easy to read and understand, for these bookcase blocks, I decided to include no color indicators on the individual pieces, specifically because as you get to some of the small, finer details, it's only a 10-inch block, so if you go to even a remotely detailed character or piece, you're going to get some pretty small sections, and it's really hard to put a color identifier and a section identifier in that itty bitty section. So I don't have any color indicators on mine, and how I fix that is I just color them in with the color pencils. Nothing crazy. So for this block, I already know that I'm going to stick with this blue theme here. So I'm going to need a combination of light blues and dark blues, and then a different fabric for the book and the actual gate door itself. So I'm going to pick out of my colored pencils a couple of different dark blues, or dark teals, depending on what you want to call them, and then a couple of light ones as well. So I've got 3 of each. You could certainly follow the exact colors that are listed on the pattern. I'm going to make mine a little more scrappy. So each individual kind of half of the castle. So here, how I designed these is that these are supposed to be castle pillars. Obviously it's made of glass, so I went ahead and made them the color blue. But because they're pillars, I imagined it like there's a sun over here on the left-hand side of the picture. So you've got light sides of the castle that are reflecting light, and then you've got dark sides of the castle that are in shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use darker colored blue for all of the shadow pieces, and then a lighter colored blue for all of the kind of pieces that are in the sun, to give it a little bit more of a 3D look and not just look like a bunch of pillars in the middle of your bookcase. I think that'll look pretty good. So I'm going to color the light sections with a combination of 3 different colored pencils, and the dark sections with a combination of 3 different ones of those. I'm going to color the book and the gate. Actually, I'll stick with that color. I'll color those with pink, since I use pink in here. I haven't quite decided what fabric I'm going to use for those 2 yet, but I will do that here later on. So whenever you go to color in your pieces, they don't have to be perfect by any means. I usually just color over the number like that, but you could certainly color the entire piece like this. While I have my maroon out, I'm going to find B1 and color that pink section and put that away. So now I'm going to do all of my light and dark sections here. I like to have a reference, except I'm going to use the paper side, because that will make sure that they all, this and this match. Meaning, if we look at the specific F piece over here, so we've got F1, or sorry, F2, F2, 1, 1, 5, 5, right? So everything kind of is in order, lines up. If we were to put the fabric side down, you can see that it's switched. So now we have the F5 over here on the left. It's on the right-hand side, but F5 is on the left-hand side of the piece, which is opposite of down here. We have it on the right side. So that's confusing for me, so I don't do it. Again, I only work off of the paper side, and that's what I'm going to do moving here on out. But again, you may find it useful to work off of the fabric side. To each their own, and you do what works best for you. So I'm going to color these real quick. F2, F4, C1, C5. And I'm going to use the light color for F1, F5, C1, C6. I'm going to jump over here to D1 is dark, D6 is dark, A3 is dark, A5 is dark, A1 is light, 6 is light, D5 is light, D3 is light, and then finally E6 is dark, oops, dark, 1 is dark, 5 is, oh, that's not the correct color, it's almost like a gray. So that light blue and light blue. Oh, can't forget my B4. B4 is also dark. Dark, dark, then B2 is light. Can't forget the corners around the door. So after you've got all those colored in, then you're going to take your scissors. Do not use your nice fabric scissors. These are just some regular scissors that I use for paper. And then I'm going to cut out each individual piece. Now, some people cut exactly along the 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is this dotted line here. I do not do that. I keep my cuts very rough. I usually leave a lot of extra fabric on until the very, very end. Whenever I sew the pieces together, that's when I trim. And I do this so that just in case there is a slight misalignment on my part, not necessarily on the pattern's part, but on my part, I have a little extra leeway, a little extra grace to make it fit if I have some extra fabric and I don't cut it super, super close. But again, I've seen people do it both ways. You do whichever works best for you. And if you don't know what works best for you, try it a couple of different ways. If you try it one way and you absolutely do not like that, then try it another way. There's really no wrong way to do this. You'll notice that if you ask a question, or if you see people ask questions on how do I pick the right size fabric, how do I attach the fabric to the paper, how do I do this, how do I do that, you're always going to get a very individualized answer, meaning each person does it slightly different, so you're probably not going to get the same answer every time from every person. But again, that's okay. Nothing wrong with that at all. Figure out what works best for you. So now that we have all of our individual pieces roughly cut out and color-coded, I kind of skipped over this, but I typically leave the background as white in my color pieces. And that's just, honestly, because I'm too lazy to go through and color every single background piece. The upside of that is I save time. The downside of that is that if I miss a piece, say I missed part of the castle to color it blue, my default is then that it's now background. So you can really kind of, if you don't double check yourself as you're sewing, you can get some random background pieces where you don't want it. But again, to each person, do what you want. You could absolutely come in here and color with the black. Since my background is going to be black, I could color those pieces, but again, I typically don't do that. So now we're on to where do we start? Where do we go from here? On the first page, it tells me that the recommended fabric for this is 1/8 to 1/4 of a yard of background fabric per block, and then scraps for the remainder of the block. These skinny pieces here, you can see they're not very wide, so you could probably almost fit 2 parts of the castle like per like jelly roll strip. So if you have a bunch of jelly roll strips that are 2 inches wide, 2.5 inches wide, some of these you could probably get away with a 1 inch wide strip. That would be perfect for this particular block as well as almost any of the other blocks. Book spines also are really, really good use for jelly roll strips or thin strips of fabric. So I like to hoard all of my scraps and use them as I see fit. And I think paper piecing is, 1, great for making scraps if you order bulk fabric, and then 2, it's a really good way to use scraps as well. So now that we know kind of how much fabric we need, where do we go from here? How do we approach this? I have a 1/4 yard of fabric or 1/8 of a yard of background fabric and a bunch of scraps. How do I know what size to cut it? How do I know how to attach the fabric to the paper to get started? Well, we're going to answer all of that. So I'm going to start with the F section on the far left-hand side. So I'm going to work left to right. But again, you could work in whatever direction you want. That's just going to work for my brain at the moment. So I have this particular section, and what I like to do is I like to cut my background fabric into various size strips. So what do you mean by a strip? So if I have 4 yards of background fabric for my entire quilt, obviously working with a single 4-yard piece of fabric is going to be difficult. It's very cumbersome to move around and just not that much fun. So what I like to do is from my larger cuts of fabric, I will cut, again, what I call strips. Meaning that if I have a large piece of fabric, this is 108 wide backing fabric, so it is extra, extra long, which I think is awesome for background because you have so much of it. So what I mean is, if I have my big piece of fabric, where do I go from here? I will cut strips of it. Now, how wide of strips do you cut? I hate to give the answer, but that really kind of depends. So if you look at your pieces here and compare them to your pieces here, these F3, F6, they're not going to use a whole lot of fabric, a whole lot of width of fabric. So if I probably cut a 2-inch wide strip, I'd have more than enough fabric for that, as well as all of these other little parts in the various blocks right here, kind of near the tops of the castle. I also want to cut a wide strip for this big chunk of background here as well as on all the other blocks. So I'm going to start with a skinnier one. Again, these do not have to be specific. They don't have to be exact. They really don't even have to be straight. The only reason that I'm using a ruler right now is because it's so thick, just so I didn't slip. But it doesn't have to be straight. The cuts don't have to be perfect. It's totally fine to have them kind of various sizes. Now, you don't want them in a huge shape of an S because that's going to be difficult to get a straight edge on your pattern. But it does not have to be perfect. Don't spend a whole lot of time doing that. So then I would go and I would cut probably a larger chunk, probably about this wide here, and repeat the same. And I've done that right here. So I'm going to put the rest of my background fabric off to the side for my next block and continue on my way. So now I've got, again, a wide-ish strip of background fabric and a couple of strips of smaller, thinner background fabrics. And I will use those and I'll grab from those. So now I'm gonna start with the F block, and how we start this is you're going to find your F1 piece and your F2 piece. Again, we're just gonna go in order. So we're gonna do 1 to 2, then 3, then 4, 5, 6, and then 7. F1. So F1 is my light color. So I'm going to break up my fabrics again into light and dark-ish. They don't have to be perfect. I just want to make sure I don't put two colors of the same next to each other. I think that'll be cool, right? Yeah. So I'm going to do this one for my F1, super light blue. And for the F2, I think that'll look pretty good. I think it's still kind of light, but that's okay. I'm fine with that. So how do you know where to put this first piece of fabric? They're very much not connected, and there's no directions on how to go from here. So what I would recommend now is a little light box. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. This one I think was like a $15, $20 one I got off of Amazon. But typically, honestly, if I'm just working by myself, I don't even use this little light box. I got it for some collage quilting. That's mainly my use for it. But for giving directions for foundation paper piecing, I find that this is actually really useful. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold up. So now that we have our F piece on the light box, we're going to line up our F1 fabric piece to the back side of this piece of paper. Again, I think the hardest thing about foundation paper piecing is realizing that you have the paper side, and then you're going to have the pretty fabric side. So for this one, it doesn't really matter because it's blue on blue. Like, there's not really a good side or a bad side or a right or a wrong side to the fabric. But this is the, quote, right side. You can see my seam from a scrap piece earlier. So I'm going to put right side down and then put paper on top of it. So I've got paper up and then right side up. Wrong side together, back side of the paper together. And what I'm checking here is I want to make sure that fabric piece that I just put down for F1 covers all of the outline of F1, which I'm going to trace in red, plus 1/4 inch seam allowance on every single one of those sides. So it really needs to like come to like here. So like that's the whole area that the piece needs to fill out. So if I had a smaller piece, I can even turn it sideways and save a little bit of fabric, and I could go like that, and that would be perfect. So I've got roughly 1/4 inch on this side, and then well over 1/4 inch on all the other 3 sides that I will trim at a later date. So now that I have this lined up, you can either use a glue stick and put a dab of glue on the back of here and then stick it down. But what I like to do is I will use a flathead pin. I have some awesome batwing flathead pins that I will use. So now I have our F1 attached, and then now we're done with the light box for this piece. We'll bring it out on the next one again. So now that we have the F1 piece attached to the paper, I'm going to find the piece of fabric that I want for my F2, which is this one. I'm going to flip this, and so notice this is the seam that I'm going to sew between F1 and F2 right here. So that is the same place that I'm going to put my F2 piece. just like that. Now actually let me back up one more step. So now that we have our F1 piece attached, we're going to trim the seam between F1 and F2 to 1/4 of an inch. I like to use a piece of cardstock or a post-it card, something with heavy cardstock that you can use to fold that edge. Then I'm going to come in and make sure that this is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I had a little bit extra fabric, so I will cut that off. Now I do use a ruler for this. Again, sometimes if I'm going quick, I won't, but if I want it to be a very straight edge and an accurate 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I will use the ruler for it. So now we're going to sew the seam between F1 and F2 on that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance that we just cut. Turn to take, that's this guy right here. I'm going to lay down right sides together, F2 fabric onto F1 fabric. And I will pin it again so that it doesn't move. I don't want to pin it up here because that's where I'm going to sew. I'm going to pin it somewhere down here to where it's still in the paper, but I'm not going to sew on it at all. Again, come over. It's upside down, but if I look at the F1 and the F2, got my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then now I've got the F2 piece that's also a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And so the reason why I don't have to do any more measurements is I know I trimmed this light blue to 1/4 of an inch and it's straight. Therefore, as long as I line up the dark blue with it, it's also going to be straight and it's also going to be 1/4 of an inch. So now I'm going to take this over and go sew it. When I sew it, I'm going to reduce my stitch length to 1 or like a 1.2. Mine only has a 1.5 or a 1, so I default to 1. That will make sure that you have a lot more perforations on the paper, and it makes it it makes the paper very easy to remove at the end. If you have a larger stitch length, like even at 1.5, I have some difficulties that as I go to tear away the paper at the very end, sometimes I'll pull seams on accident because there's not enough perforations that the thread will break rather than the paper tearing. So I always like to do 1, but again, to each their own. Different people do it different ways. Some people spray water on the backs of their blocks to make the paper soft to remove them easier. I don't like doing that, but you could do that if that worked best for you. When you sew with your reduced stitch length, you're going to sew on this line here. So these are going to be the ones that, these 2 points are going to be the ones that show up in your finished block. But when you sew, use a different color. When you start sewing, you want to sew a little bit past that line, out here and out here, where those 2 yellow lines are. So you don't have to backstitch, just like with traditional piecing. This seam will be encapsulated in another seam, so you don't have to backstitch, but you want to make sure your seam extends long enough past there that whenever you do go to attach that piece, you're 100% sure that that seam's encapsulated. So I've now sewed that seam together. I can remove the flathead pins, put my little hedgehog here. I can remove the pin on the back, my little hedgehog. So now we have, you can see the perforations of the seam that we just sewed here. It extended up and below on the yellow line. And on the backhand side, you can also see how tight those stitches are. And we've got 1/4 of an inch. So now what we do, okay, this is a good lesson learned. I did not mean to do this, but this is a good one to capture on camera. So what happened here is I didn't pin it well enough whenever I sewed. It's frustrating. So you can see that my seam is supposed to extend all the way out here, but this light blue piece of fabric got folded in, which sucks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rip some seams, yay, and I only have to go back just a little bit, like maybe 1/4 of an inch. So I'll do that. If I mess up the first one bad enough, honestly, sometimes I'll just rip everything out and start over again. Whenever I went to go pull it up, it kind of just fell out, again, because you're using a 1 stitch length, so the paper is very, very perforated. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this out. I know I have enough fabric left over. It'll be fine. We'll start again. Okay, so, see, no one's perfect. No one's perfect. going to turn on our light box again. I'm going to put my fabric down. I'm going to line it up. You can already see where the seam allowance is, so you could almost line that up. Perfect, right there. That's my 1/4 inch. Take my flathead. Make sure I get all of it in. Right there. I'm going to put another one down here. And then again, flip it over. And sew on the dark blue. Okay, I'm back. Just sewed the F1 to the F2. I'm gonna flip it over so you can see the seam right there. Flip it over, it's the seam right here. Then we're gonna fold it out. And now we've got our first seam in our F piece. So I'm going to go iron this. Some people don't like to iron. You know what? I said I was gonna go iron it. I am crushing it today. So because my paper is so perforated, I'm actually going to leave one of these flatheads in, which I should not have taken out. I'm gonna put that, I'm gonna leave it in. Managed to mess this one all up. And sometimes if you mess up the paper so bad, sometimes you just need to reprint it. Well, all right, so I'm gonna leave this pin in for a little bit. I'm actually probably gonna add another pin here just so it doesn't move. I'm gonna take this one out. I'm gonna move it here. So I have a pretty high tolerance for what mistakes I'll accept within a foundation paper piece, block, or quilt for that matter. I think that since we're working on small 10-inch blocks at a time, you really notice your mistakes because you're staring right at them. But whenever you put it on a block with 12, 16, 20 blocks on it, no one's gonna notice that small little spot. So I have a pretty high tolerance for it. Others do not, and that's fine. Again, you do what works best for you and what you think you can handle or not. I like to iron my scenes open. That's what I was saying earlier. Some people swear not to do that. Some people roll them. Some people use iron without steam. Some people use iron with steam. I use iron with steam. I use the iron with steam on the low setting, and it works well for me. I think it works well for complicated blocks. Really gets that seam really flat and a little less bulky. So now I got F1, F2. I just trimmed the seam allowance for F3. Got a 1/4 inch, again, roughly. And that one is going to be my background piece. So I'm going to find a piece of background fabric. How do you tell if it's big enough? Well, I just hold it up next to it. It's not very scientific. So I'm going to take my strip. And that is definitely going to be big enough. So this is definitely going to be big enough. I will have plenty of fabric on either side of this intersection and this intersection. So I'm gonna line it up. And again, how do you tell where the line is on the back side if you can't see it? Well, what I do is I will place my fingers on either end of this fabric piece. I will flip it over, and as long as they are well away from that F3 line, we have plenty of room. So I'm gonna go sew this back. And so you'll notice on this piece, I've got a lot of extra fabric just kind of hanging around the outsides here. A lot of times I'll leave that, but sometimes if it's too much, I'll just do a super quick trim to kind of get them out of my way, make sure I don't get them caught on anything. You already saw that I messed up this original seam allowance, make sure they don't get trapped under another piece. Again, just rough cut is totally fine. Now we're going to move on to the F4. I'm going to take out that pin completely since it was in my way. I'm going to take F3, 1, and go to the line between them and F4. Fold it on the line and trim it to roughly 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, you can absolutely use your ruler here. You'll probably get it a lot more accurate if you use your ruler, but yeah, quicker or not. So now I'm going to go to F4, which is another dark color. So I'm going to go, this guy. Ooh, this is a good use of this fabric. It's just barely big enough, but it will be plenty big for this piece. So I'm going to use that. And then for the light one, Yeah, I'll use that next to it, and that'll look good. So flip over. I don't really have to trim this one. Just gonna line it up, line it up. So again, put my finger here, and turn it over, and I've got plenty of room on either side of those intersections on F4. And I ironed it open. That looks good. I'm gonna move on to F5. Now I've got F5 sewn on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a super quick trim again out here. Let's get rid of that bulk fabric. And both of these pieces are big enough that I will probably keep both of those and throw them in my scrap pile again and use them for a different project or for another block. Now we're going to move on to F6, which is going to be background fabric. Again, pull that, make sure it's tight, 1/4 of an inch, seam allowance. Little bit of background, and sew it on. So now I have F6 attached, and I'm going to pull out my other flat head since I've got enough other seams in there that it shouldn't move. And now I'm going to move on to the final piece for this F section, which is F7. Encapsulate all of those seams up at the top. Now, this is a good example of kind of ways that you can work around large sections like this. So, I cut a piece of fabric earlier, background fabric. Now, if you notice, if I cut a piece and lay it on here, it is not going to cover the full area. And like me trying to match up this seam and this seam is going to be a really weird angle that I don't like to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this on to F6 or to F7 onto these pieces. And then I know I'm going to have to sew an F8 up here even though the pattern doesn't call for it. So I trimmed that line on here, and then I'm going to lay this diagonal like this, line it up with the seam allowance, and go sew it. Okay, so I sewed part of F7 on, and as you can see, there's still a corner that's completely uncovered. Do a rough trim. Rough trim. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to manually add an F8, which sounds scary, but it is not. It is extremely easy to add a different section right here, and I think it's easier to do 2 smaller pieces of fabric versus 1 really large piece of fabric. The only thing you want to make sure on is whenever you're adding a new section, this piece, the seam here that you encapsulated all of these other seams, this has to be fully covered. So like I couldn't have a piece of fabric that only went to here and then attach another one over here. No, it has to be fully touching here, just this wide. And then as we go up here, there's no seams to encapsulate, so I can add a new section. If that doesn't make sense in your head, that's totally okay. Cut a big enough piece of fabric that you don't have to worry about any of this. But again, if you are short, this is a fix for it. I'm going to take my cardstock and I'm going to line it up roughly 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to fold back, and that's roughly 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. It's already relatively straight, so I don't need to cut it with my rotary cutter. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on that fold that I just made. And so this is going to be F8. And what I'm going to do is take a piece of background fabric like this and sew it on just like this, and you will never know that you cut a piece slightly too small. No one will be able to tell. So I got that. This is the no seam between F8 and F7. I'm going to do a rough trim. And now when I turn it over, you see part of the castle. And again, you cannot tell that there is a new section up here. If I hold it right, you can see the seam allowance. Maybe if you have a very patterned background, you could see it. But you're going to have so many pieces in this block that already have different sections and backgrounds that, again, you're not going to be able to tell. So that's a good cheat. If you have a piece that's too small, you don't have to rip out any seams. You don't have to go get more fabric. It's okay. So that's our F piece. Doesn't look like much now, but I promise whenever we finish all the other pieces and sew them together, it will in fact look like a glass castle. At least I hope that other people see it as a glass castle. So I will continue on. I'll stop if I have any other comments to make. Otherwise, I'm just gonna, again, continue on at a slightly increased rate of speed, and you can watch how I make each individual section. I forgot to mention what type of paper I use whenever I print my patterns off on the computer. Some people recommend using newsprint type paper, which is very thin. I think like Carol Dokes sells some that makes the very easy to remove the paper at the end, but you can also print your sections off just like on your regular home computer using an 8.5 by 11. I typically just use regular 20-pound printer paper. I've been on the hunt to find something that's a little thinner. I've tried some like dollar store tree, some different types of paper at Walmart. I've just settled on a paper that is 100% recycled. It's actually made from sawmill wood chips, like leftovers. So I'm going to try that out. It feels thinner. It feels lighter. I think it's going to perforate very well, but this is going to be the first time that I'm going to use it. So I will keep you guys posted on how I like it and if it works. And if it does work, I will definitely share where to get that so that others can utilize it. But again, if you don't have that, just a regular printer paper, copier paper, totally fine. I would not go heavier than the standard, which is going to be 20-pound, but 20-pound makes it pretty easy to remove still. Some of the smaller pieces are a pain, but that's the downside of paper piecing, is you have to take off all the paper at some point in time.